The green light on?
It is.
Oh, there it is.
Okay, all right, good. Technology and I don't always get along, so it's a bad idea to have anything. Yeah. So, Chimiigwech for that. I think you did a great job. I feel so much better. So hopefully everybody did as well. I want to acknowledge that ceremony because it's 6:20 and my son is here with me. And this morning we were in Wata, I guess, territory community around where they are, and we were at a sunrise ceremony. So it's good to start the day with that, and it's good to sort of kind of end the day with ceremony and that connection. And it very much is related to what I'm gonna talk about today. So thank you for coming out. I know it's I don't even know where I'm supposed to wave for the online people, but I have no idea where they are, what they look like. But hello, welcome, online folks, and to those of you who are here today. So what I wanted to talk to you about is sort of around my thinking around what I see happening in the planet, the research that I've been doing, where I'm wanting it to go, how I'm thinking through some of this. And what I will say is most of what I'm going to talk to you about is what I've learned from people like Rick, because they do the work they do, from elders, from knowledge keepers, from leaders and community people. So I don't look at it as my knowledge. My job is, as a researcher or a scholar, is to go learn from people and then try to bring it back. And package is like not a great word to use, but anybody who's a teacher or scholar knows that you're trying to you're I guess mobilize the knowledge in different ways to different people, because I work in policy circles. As part of climate change, I work at the community level. I was mentioning to Dr. King tomorrow morning I will be delivering training on environmental assessment and Indigenous law for the Chiefs of Ontario. So I'm doing all kinds of things where I have to like bring knowledge together for the benefit of community and future generations and the planet. So recently I've become very interested in, I guess the field is called planetary health, but I try to think of it more as planetary well-being and earth-based reconciliation. So first I want to thank you for the invitation to come. I think it was many years ago when I was here, but it was a different campus. And it was when I was starting to be asked to start working in the climate change realm. Most of my work was dealing with water justice, water governance, water legal traditions. And mostly that came from because it was a need from communities and they needed people to work on it. And so I went, okay, I guess I'll figure out what this climate change thing is. It just seemed too big and abstract for me to kind of grab onto. So water was a lot, it was a lot of the work I was doing with First Nation communities. And so this is very much related to the climate crisis, but also we could call it a planetary health or planetary well-being crisis that we find ourselves in as well. So I'm working in all kinds of different realms. But what I've heard consistently over a number of years, because I am kind of old, so decades, is elders and knowledge holders and grandmothers and grandfathers talking always about the health of the planet. So when people like me from the university and others would come in and say, so these environmental issues that we might be facing, they would always talk about Mother Earth, which is pretty big. Like even if it was a very local kind of environmental issue, it was still, people would talk about the kind of relationship that we would have with Mother Earth, how that relationship was disrupted or disconnected in some way. So the scale was very local, but it was also very like huge. Like it's like the planet, like it's the Earth, right? Mother Earth. You always hear people talking about Mother Earth. And I never really sort of, I connected it to bigger issues around climate change, but only started recently starting to wrap around my head around this new field called planetary health. And so that's what I wanted to talk about. And when I was invited, it was more around the context of Reconciliation Week. So reconciliation was kind of on my brain, but there is a connection to this. And I'll talk a little bit about it, sort of how I'm sort of weaving this together in terms of how I'm approaching this, this work. And it's not really, in some senses it's abstract, but really I just finished a grant on this topic like last week, so I'm really hoping to like go somewhere with this over a number of years to really sort of advance this from an Indigenous perspective. So hopefully what I'm going to share with you makes sense, because it's sort of my current thinking, and it was a lot more logical as I had to fill in text in little boxes that you have to do for applications and grants these days. So I called it earth-based reconciliation. And this idea around earth-based reconciliation comes directly from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and from the elders and knowledge holders that were part of the commission. And because I have this environment sustainability lens, that's what kind of jumped out at me, along with everything else that was in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the calls to action. And then my interest in planetary well-being. What does that look like, and how do we try to get there? Because it's such a huge scale, but in some ways also related to what Rick talked about. So I will try my best to make sense for you in terms of what I'm thinking here. And this moved when we were practicing, but now it's not. Techie person. I'm pretty sure you have a name. It's not techie person. Or do I have to use? Did it freeze? What is your name? I don't want to call you techie. Brendan. Brendan. Okay. There we go. How did you do that? Was it this one? Okay. All right. Hopefully that's sorted out. Brandon, thank you. So I always like to start off with this. My point here is that Indigenous peoples, and in the land acknowledgement, is that Indigenous peoples were here for thousands of years. So our knowledge governed and took care of the territories as Indigenous peoples did for thousands of years. In fact, the knowledge existed long before people did. And what around this area, Mississaugas and Anishinaabe did was they learned from the land and learned from the earth this knowledge and laws and how to be here, and it informed our governance system. So essentially, we were complete societies. And our knowledge supported our societies for how we were going to take care of our ancestors and how we were going to take care of future generations. So it enables sustainable relationships with all of creation. Because our idea of planetary health is actually a lot bigger than the field. Like for us, it also is the stars and the moon and the sun. Like it's a lot bigger than conventional sort of ideas of environment that you might find in legislation. So to me, this is always important. And a lot of the work that I do, I find myself in a lot of climate change circles at the moment, for lack of a better word. And people are always looking for knowledge. And I'm always saying, you know what? Indigenous peoples already have climate knowledge. You're just not that good at listening to it or understanding what's being shared in the particular context. And it's, for people like me to try to figure out, okay, how do I try to communicate this to other folks? And this, in some ways, this draws on sort of my experience and observations with climate assessment. So I've contributed to the Ipcc ones, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but also Canadian assessments. And I was always in charge of the Indigenous stuff, usually asked the last minute, as usual. And so I had less time than all the other researchers and scientists to pull the work together. And I would find that there was a real gap in terms of what it was, how Indigenous people understood change over time, environmental change and their lives. It was more the paradigm of people, if it was there, people who were kind of studying Indians, as opposed to Indigenous-led kind of research. So there was huge gaps. It was really hard to do, and there was very specific criteria that we had to meet to do this work. And so I've always been a big advocator of saying, Indigenous peoples already know. We've already had to go through dramatic environmental change over the last, in Canada, probably a couple centuries, Turtle Island over 500 years. So, but we've always been here and we have this knowledge. It's just, how can it find its way into governance and decision-making spaces? And it's thousands of years old, probably older. So the pipe and the eagle story. I don't have time to tell the story, but Rick talked a little bit about the role of the eagle in our I guess in our worldview and in our ontology. But the reason I'll mention this story, and maybe I'll have time to come back to it later, is it's one of my favorite stories that I'm working with right now. I understand it to be a climate change story, because that's sort of the lens I'm kind of seeing the world through at the moment. And essentially, our stories also point to what we think our solutions are going to be and how we've faced major, I guess, challenges before. So in the story, Anishinaabe are facing destruction because we're not respecting natural law or our original instructions from the creator. So we weren't perfect. The difference was we had our own ways of solving our challenges, something that's sort of been denied to us through colonizations. And it's the animals, in particular the eagle, who petitions on our behalf to the creator to withhold destruction if they can still find people who are still following those original instructions and following natural law. So where that becomes really important to me right now is sort of part of the rage in Canada and around the world is nature-based solutions, but it's sort of based on sort of like a more of a capitalist system, which is not really how Indigenous people think about nature-based solutions. And where it's a natural world, actually, because the natural has more knowledge than we do, actually helps us out of the situation that we're in. If you know how to work with the natural world, if you know how to work with the eagle and our plant and animal relatives, that they have more knowledge and they can help us. And that's what this story tells me. There's a different way of relating to the natural world that we need to start to embrace. And around the world, a lot of the times it's Indigenous peoples who still know how to do that. So there's a lot of interest in Indigenous peoples. Living well in responsibilities. So I think about this all the time in terms of what does it mean to live well in the face of what we're challenging? Like what does it mean to live well when every time I just call them, I'll talk about them later in the presentation, what I call the disaster reports. Every time another Ipcc report comes out, every time another IPBS reports on biodiversity comes out, World Water Report, every World Water Day, it's not looking good. It's like, we've hit the tipping point, we're on the other side of it. And so what does it mean to live well in light of this? And what are our responsibilities as people? And part of what I understand in Anishinaabe legal traditions is that we have an obligation to live well. And we cannot live well unless the natural world or the planet is also well. Like, we have an obligation. It isn't so human-centric, that there's part of our obligation according to our laws and knowledge is to live well. So planetary health, so again, I just call them the disaster reports. Not looking good, getting worse all the time. So how do we try to change this? But what's interesting about these reports that I find is they're all calling for transformative change. They're all calling for massive transformation. It's not a tweaking of the status quo. It's not like the business as usual and maybe shifting things a little bit. It's actually calling for quite dramatic transformation. And we haven't kind of got there yet in terms of like the same kind of sort of worldview and paradigms that got us into the mess likely aren't going to be the ones that are going to get us out of it. So Indigenous peoples, time and time again. So one of the things I do, because I find myself in spaces where I have to be the Indigenous voice for everybody on the planet, and as I read and try to understand Indigenous people's perspectives through international sustainable development, water, climate change declarations, where hundreds of people get together and they agree what is it that they're saying about their relationships. And what they've been saying for a very long time is that there's a disconnect. People have a disconnect to the natural world. And this is causing this essential kind of relationship is part of the problem, the root of the problem. So the United Nations Environment Program came out with a report, Making Peace with Nature. They started to recognize that there is a war on nature. Like literally, saying that in a report, what are we going to do to change that? What does that look like? And again, I say, well, I kind of think maybe Indigenous peoples might have some ideas about that, about how to do that. Because what we do know, and this is also in UN reports, and people are doing more place-based research around this, is that on the planet, Indigenous peoples, I prefer to say caretake, about 20% of the Earth's landmass, but that's where 80% of the biodiversity is. And that's where mostly Indigenous languages are spoken. So people know, like, okay, these people, they know something, and they're trying to figure out what is it that they know that enables this. And then, so a lot of these, you know, a narrative is coming out that Indigenous peoples can be leaders and contribute to these broader solutions. So how do we not be at war with the Earth? So again, a lot of this has to do with disconnection from the Earth. And a lot of the Indigenous climate circles that I'm in, whether it's elders and knowledge holders, grandmothers and grandfathers, what they really push and they really talk about is how do we connect back to the Earth? How do we reestablish this connection when it's been disrupted? Because this is true also in Indigenous communities due to colonial processes, dispossession from your ancestral lands and knowledge for all kinds of reasons. So that's actually what they consider to be the sort of the root cause of a lot of the challenges that environmental or ecological challenges that we're facing. And I actually paid a lot of attention to this recently. I pulled up, like, what is the Ipcc definition of climate change? And you'll get this, it's all about carbon, like you'll get this, you know, paragraph long definition of climate change. But when we asked elders that, they just said it's because people aren't connected to the Earth anymore. And they don't know how to relate to the Earth, and they're not taking care of the Earth. They're not living up to their responsibilities. They're not following natural laws. They don't know the language. So they had very different ideas in terms of what is the root cause of the challenges that we're facing. And I find in a lot of the climate change circles that I'm in, I call them there's a lot of focus on carbon, which there has to be. Like, there's no doubt about that. You know, Canada strives to be, I guess, carbon neutral by 2050. But when I'm in these other circles, people don't like the other C words that I bring up, like colonialism or capitalism. Those are not very popular words to bring up because they just want to focus on carbon, sort of usually a techno kind of solution to that. But I'm, you know, engaged in these other spaces with elders and knowledge holders. We're talking about, you know, these challenges differently, and I'm trying to figure out how to connect them and then communicate it to people who make decisions and set policy and decide what knowledge is going to be valuable in assessments. So I wanted to point to the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Mother Earth, which points to the Earth as being a living entity, and some of the principles there. I'm not going to read that, but it also speaks to what our responsibilities are to be caretakers of the Earth. So this is another UN report, Living in Harmony by 2050. I actually think it needs to happen a lot sooner than that. And for a lot of Indigenous peoples, this is already what people are striving for. So in this particular report are nature-based solutions that are already talked about, but it kind of in a weird way. Like in Canada's, it's sort of like, how many trees can we plant? But then destroy something like down the river kind of thing. Like, it's a very bizarre idea what nature-based solutions are. Not the same as what I've talked about in the Pipe and the Eagle story. They call for transformation again, recognition of Indigenous peoples, like what does Indigenous-led conservation look like? What does Indigenous-led research around climate science look like? So there's a policy framework for this in Canada, and recognition of Indigenous knowledge. And I'll explain the difference between knowledge and knowledge systems. So there is a recognition there of the contributions that Indigenous peoples can make in this recognition that there's a war on the Earth, and that we need to figure out how to live in harmony with the Earth. Earth-based reconciliation. So how does this relate to reconciliation? And what kind of jumped out at me when I was reviewing and reading the Truth and Reconciliation report when it came out in 2015. Again, it always jumps out at me because I have that environmental kind of sustainability lens, is this idea of we're not going to be able to achieve reconciliation among people unless we achieve this reconciliation among with the natural world and with the Earth. And what some of the elders said, a lot of it led by Elder Crowshoe, out, I believe he's Blackfoot, out around the Calgary area, like they were really trying to say that we have to move beyond the human dimension. Like there's this other knowledge and this other way of being that you can learn from other entities, other beings in the world other than people. So it's like always not thinking that we're the center of the universe. So they really stressed this idea about that we needed to do that. But it didn't show up as any one of the calls to action. So it's like, okay, how do we do that then? They're calling for this. It's going to be very difficult to achieve reconciliation among people if we're not reconciling this relationship with the natural world, if we're not going beyond the human dimension. So that's sort of how I'm connecting like the idea of planetary health to this idea of reconciliation. I think that's what the United Nations is calling for by living in harmony with the earth, but they're not calling it that. And then I see it in the Canadian context with the elders and traditional knowledge holders, their contributions to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This is one of the principles that I see. So in my mind, the 10 principles that are part of TRC can help us try to do that. The recognition of Indigenous people's knowledge systems, oral histories and laws and protocols, connection to the land. A lot of what I've been talking about so far is actually there as part of the principles. Like, how do we actually recognize that? Some of my research is, well, actually a central part of it, what I talked about this morning at the AI gathering was natural laws and how we implement them. But that's like 40 minutes. We don't have time for me to talk about that. So what are our laws? And the reason I'm so interested in that is clearly the laws that exist now are failing because things are getting worse. So what are other laws that can help guide how we can be different, how we could be different in the world, how we can transform in the world? So principles of planetary health. So I become really interested in planetary health. And partly this was because I was involved in the Lancet policy briefs. So these are Lancet, they're like the top medical journal, I think, in the world, and they do these policy briefs, and different countries do them. So I was invited maybe 3 years ago, probably this year's should be coming out in a week or so, and because they wanted to include more Indigenous perspective. So I was Indigenous perspective, which I'm glad they did. And so I've been working, with them, and you have like 1,200 words to try to like influence policymakers in terms of climate change and health. But this year they talked more about planetary health, and I hadn't really connected with that. Some scholars call that ecological determinants of health. Like in the Indigenous health world, they call it social or environmental determinants, but ecological is kind of another way that planetary health is being framed. I was also an advisory committee for the Public Health Officer of Canada, their climate change and health report coming out, where they were almost kind of going there in a planetary health perspective, but ecological determinants. So it's kind of emerging, and so I became very interested in it. And I thought, what do Indigenous people say about this? Because I kind of knew what elders talked about, like this relationship with Mother Earth, what that relationship should look like, and how we learn from Mother Earth. And for Anishinaabe, our constitution is based on that relationship with the earth and the 4 elements that Rick talked about. So I found a couple pieces. So probably the go-to person, because it's like one person, it's that I can find in Canada and United States, is Nicola Redveers. So she's now based out of the United States. She's Dene. And she's writing now about planetary health, starting to do research around planetary health. So these principles that I talk about in this slide come from her work. So she's published in the Lancet and other journals. So the principles or the foundation of Indigenous conceptions of planetary health speak to, again, what she calls our natural laws, or our First Nation laws. So the non-human laws, the ones that come from the earth itself, those laws that exist there. And this deep connection to all that's living and non-living. So what is our relationship like to the natural world? And what are these laws? And that's one of the first principles of this. And then they talk about a set of values that's part of this: honesty, love, empathy, and justice. Probably in the climate change circles I'm in, we do talk about justice, But love doesn't often come up, but it always comes up in Indigenous climate change discussions, almost without exception. So they talk about, okay, these are the values that are important in order to be able to achieve this connection with the earth. And Indigenous knowledge. Indigenous knowledge is informing part of this, these ideas of planetary health. So she did some primary research that sort of advanced a lot of these ideas around what some of these principles are. But but you can look up some of that stuff if you're really interested in Nicole Redbeer's work. Then there was another article, and it came out of New Zealand with Maori. And again, very similar to what Nicole Redbeer's work was speaking to in terms of planetary health. And they talked about the planet as, again, a web of life. It's alive. The Earth is alive. The Mother Earth is a living person. So connected to that Declaration on the Rights of Mother Earth. So there's that narrative that's been there for a while, and now starting to try to find expression in a real thing called planetary health, like a subdiscipline. The well-being of the planet and people are at the heart of decision making. And that spirituality is part of this, is at the core of this. In fact, spirituality was in the title, and I really hadn't seen that in any of the planetary health literature, which you have to look at when you're writing grants, is what does the literature say? And it draws, again, on different values: love, kindness, justice, and equity. So there's this set of values that becomes really important in terms of thinking about planetary health. So those are just a few of the bullets from the article, but those are really kind of it. Either Nicole Redbeer's have written it or this. So the Indigenous people haven't really been able to insert themselves into the space, even though pretty well I can go to any First Nation meeting and they're going to be talking about planetary health, but not saying planetary health or planetary well-being. And one of the ways that planetary health is being also talked about when I first started looking at the literature was it was very human-centric. It said, we have to take care of the planet in order for humans to survive. It was more about how the health of the planet impacted human health, which is true, but it didn't really speak to people's responsibility, like humanity's responsibility to the earth. It didn't speak to it as a reciprocal kind of relationship. And that, there was a different ontological, I guess, perspective, in that the earth wasn't, also in that narrative, wasn't understood to be alive and being a person as well. So we do have different sort of views about what this could be, but they are teeny bit coming together with at least two different scholars who are looking at this. But I think there's something there based on what I see, in communities and on the ground in terms of. But I think it's probably better to say planetary well-being. That's sort of the terminology that I'm starting to use for this, just to distinguish it between, the broader planetary health sort of perspective. So how do we understand this relationship? Like, how would Anishinaabeg think about this? So I'm Anishinaabeg from Whitebush River First Nation around Manitoulin Island. So how do we come to live in the world? Starting with creation. Creation stories tell us about, gives us guidance for how to behave properly in the world. How are we going to relate to creation, all of creation, and all our relatives in creation? So a lot of it starts with our creation stories. That's where we get a lot of our guidance for how to be in the world. And for the Anishinaabe, our ultimate purpose is to support life. That's what our decisions would be seeking to do, and all life, not just for people. So the other side of this is the colonial context interferes greatly with with Indigenous peoples and the planet's well-being. It's a reality that we have to deal with. There's historical and there's ongoing colonialism, so it hasn't gone away. Again, that other C word that people don't like to talk about in a climate change context necessarily. So again, this is recognized in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and there's recommendations for how we can move out of this place. So to me, it's always important to recognize that, because if you don't recognize that there's colonialism and ongoing colonialism, then your solutions that people propose may actually reinforce colonialism in Indigenous communities. So that's a very real possibility. So some of you may or may not, probably most of you, as I look around, probably not, that when the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples report came out in 1996, its main finding was that solutions for the Indigenous problem, well, at the time they said Indian problem, were flawed. They were wrong. So other people's solutions don't work for Indigenous peoples. We have to have our own solutions, and we're happy to share them with others. So if you don't account for that colonial history and the reality of Indigenous peoples, there's a real possibility that you can recolonize and cause more harm. And I actually see that quite a bit in some of the, I'll just say, climate circles that I find myself in. Like, people have their like solutions that are really gung-ho, and they make no sense for a flying community. They make no sense in Indigenous reality, where people are trying to reconnect to the earth and trying to exercise rights, when a lot of the solutions are about getting people off the land, I find. So it has to be accounted for, or it could cause a lot of problems later on, and in fact make things worse in Indigenous communities. And most really scientists, in my experience, aren't trained to do this. They don't even know what to do with that word. They're just like, I don't know how it's relevant. Like, so we have a lot of work to do. So some assumptions: Indigenous societies are more vulnerable to climate change impacts due to these colonial forces, but we've also adapted and survived. So this transformation that people are calling for, that's what we've done. So I can stand here, Rick can do what he's doing, my buddy from Garden River, my son, we can say we're Anishinaabe or Mi'kmaq despite genocidal policies, because we had to. So we've been able to do that. Now, I always say the rest of society is starting to face this annihilation through climate change and planetary crisis. Like, it's not looking good, but we've had to do it already. Like, that's what we had to do, and we've come out the other side. So we know how to do that. There's something to learn from Indigenous peoples, and Indigenous peoples, despite everything, are generally willing to share. That's been my experience. Like, when we were working on the water governance work for Chiefs of Ontario after Walkerton, so over 20 years ago. And leadership was really pushing, okay, we're going to include Indigenous knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge. And we're just like, why would people want to do that? But when we went to go talk to elders and knowledge holders, they said, yeah, because like their decision making is not helpful. So they kind of need us and our knowledge. Not willy-nilly, like there's protocols to observe and respect to be given. And but people do feel that they could contribute. So again, this is one of those international declarations where Indigenous peoples have been calling for what's been happening for a long time before any of the scientific assessments. And here I just focused on, again, this harmony with the natural laws of the earth was really being emphasized even way back then, before, this is 1995, before like people started to care about this thing called planetary health. I think what I'll say here, I'm not going to read this. It's a lot of text. Apologies for that. Usually I try not to use so much text, but what I wanted to point out here is that colonialism is very insidious in terms of trying to seek justice. So what I find in some of the work that I do is the way that Indigenous peoples experience climate change is not in a siloed way that academics and scientists tend to study it, and policymakers. So they tend to divide it up between risk and vulnerability, mitigation, adaptations, resist. So there's this whole like, and different researchers are doing the mitigation, different ones are doing the adaptation, different ones are doing the resilience, different ones are doing, governance isn't even like really in there in terms of Indigenous people. And when community people are saying, okay, these are the changes that we've been experiencing, that was environmental change, not climate change. And they're like, actually, it's an intensification of these broader processes. It's almost like, to me, when I was asked to talk about cumulative impact assessment, was climate change is almost like the logical outcome of all these major impacts that are happening on the natural world. Like, surprise, like, what do you think's going to happen in a cumulative sense? So sometimes I find like Indigenous people's knowledge and experience is dismissed because people are so stuck in the silos, they don't really understand the lived experience. And the fact is, all of us experience climate change in a lived reality, not in silos. Like we're not experiencing it that way. That's how we study it though. And then we document it and do assessments, and then that influences public policy. So we need to be not so siloed. Land-based governance. So what ensures resilience? So what, in the work that I've done, when I started to, and I focus a lot on climate change because that tends to be the thing that's sort of blowing people's minds at the moment, because all kinds of crazy things are happening, fires and now drought, and last year was flooding about this time out west. Is so how do we, what is the knowledge? What is the knowledge that enabled Indigenous peoples to survive? It wasn't like government solutions. That's what the Royal Commission already pointed out after, you know, millions of dollars and a number of years. So what is it that enabled Indigenous people to transform and survive and to be here? And really it was our own knowledge, our own governance, our own ways of life. And this is just an image of my family in the sugar bush. So people are still continuing these activities despite over time they may have been illegal. People are trying to get you off the land in all kinds of different ways. So our land-based, or it's probably more accurate to say, I starting to say earth-based now, because it's not just land, it's also water. If you're Inuit, it's ice. Like the earth is so diverse in what it looks like. So, but we tend to say land-based in literature, but really it's a lot broader than that. That's what enabled it. Maintaining that connection and continuing to learn from the earth itself. A lot of our resilience comes from these land-based activities. This is a picture of my niece and my nephew in our sugar bush. I'm getting too excited, so now I'm starting to lose my voice. But that's what's going to enable our resilience into the future. So when Indigenous peoples are looking at solutions, a lot of it is land-based. How are we going to connect again? How are we going to learn from the land? Not just be on it, but also learning from the land, or from the earth itself. That's where our well-being is derived from. Is from these relationships. I wanted to reflect a little bit on a elders and youth climate change workshop, a gathering that I facilitated. I realized now about 5 years ago. At this gathering, I had so many aha moments, things that I was exposed to in a very sort of abstract, maybe policy kind of way, and then you're meeting with youth and elders, and it's very real in terms of how people understand and experience and describe what they're experiencing. So it was an initiative by youth to meet with elders to begin to share climate knowledge, which there's very few opportunities for Indigenous peoples to do that, actually. Most of the times we're asked to be part of other people's gatherings, and then we input into those processes. We don't really have a lot of opportunities to kind of do our own thing. There's really only one sort of Indigenous climate assessment that I've seen done in Canada, and that's by the Quebec Women's Association did one in 2019. And I'm working on one with a number of other scholars as part of the Natural Resources Canada series. So there's going to be a standalone Indigenous report. The United States has been doing that for years, but Canada is going to have its first one that we're finally working on. So there's not a lot of opportunities to gather and talk about this. Mind you, I did come back from the AFN climate gathering. That was the second one. The last one was just in the Yukon just before the pandemic. Like we just made it under the wire. Like it ended like on the 8th, and then maybe I think 10 days later the worldwide pandemic was called. So what was interesting about this was how do we start imagining our future? So there's no doubt, you know, we're seeing all these disaster reports, like things aren't looking good. People are aware of this. A lot of anxiety around this in a lot of people and a lot of young people. So how do we start self-determining? How do we start imagining a future? Because actually in a lot of our stories, hope is embedded within them, especially when there's the eagle, with the eagles in the story. And what the young people came up with, because I facilitated, but they organized this whole session, was where they talked about love for the earth. That's what they saw as being a climate solution. And so that's what one of the images is. And they and I hadn't seen that before in any of the these other spaces and circles that I found myself. And I went, oh, well, that's a different narrative than I see carbon all the time in a lot of the other spaces. Ceremonies connecting to the earth. And what I found, that one of the aha moments I had at this workshop, so it was funded by, at the time in Ontario, when there was in environment and climate change, now there isn't, there's no climate change strategy either, so it was funded by them. So they were really wanting to sort of run their climate solutions by this group. And I noticed, I didn't clue in right away, but I noticed a lot of the solutions that were being proposed, like basically the program funding that they had. This is climate change program funding you can apply for to address climate change in your communities, was very much geared towards getting people off the land. And what youth and elders were saying, elders were like, we want to teach people language, we want to get people back on the land, they need to know how to hunt, they need to go where to get water, where to pick medicines. And that's what youth wanted to do. They wanted to reconnect back to the land. So I found that there was very different ideology about what the solutions were going to be to for how to move forward, or what a self-determined sort of solution might be to climate change. So that was really interesting, and it took me a while to clue into that. I went, something's sort of weird going on here, I'm not sure what, and then I clued in. I went, oh, there's different ideologies happening here. And I've now noticed it in a lot of other spaces that I find myself in after that. The other thing that I find in the more academic climate circles is this idea that there's a big push to try to get Indigenous peoples, especially Indigenous peoples in the North, to accept the Southern solutions. And again, it took me a while to put my finger on it. Like, I was really uncomfortable in some of the sessions, and I couldn't figure out what it was that was bothering me. And then later on, the aha moment came, that, oh, they have that development perspective, whereas only we can get those primitive people to accept our solutions, everything would be cool. And I went, oh no, that still exists. Because that was very much what people were saying, like, this is the solution. If only we can get them to accept this, and they keep like wanting to be on the land and whatever else, right? So, which, for a long time, people considered that to be primitive. So I've been noticing these things with these underlying sort of attitudes and ideologies that still exist out there. That in many ways, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and other work is trying to get people to sort of let go of that and think about Indigenous peoples as contributing to solutions and to the future. People at this gathering talk about the importance of Indigenous knowledge and getting youth on the land. And what was interesting about the session this morning is some of the leaders I remember from like 3 decades ago. And we talked about how there's a big change and how we talk about this. Rick was just mentioning that to me just before this session, that we're talking about things in Indigenous communities that were maybe sort of, that we didn't talk about so much before because we're just coming fresh off. It's illegal to have your ceremonies. You don't talk about laws. And now people are talking more and more about that. It's becoming more, we're documenting and codifying these, and they're becoming part of our assessment processes and how we govern. So a lot more, it was always there, but it wasn't so open, I guess, and it wasn't so, I guess, institutionalized like you might see it now. So Indigenous knowledge was really emphasized by elders and by youth at this session. Language is really important, because when you think in the language, you think differently about your relationship to the world, and you need to have the language speakers, and they talked about the importance of teaching language to young people or old people like me. Like, I always have a lot of aha moments when speaking with fluent language speakers who think in the language. And again, what our self-determined solutions look like. I think, I see in some policy circles where that's starting to happen. Like, Canada has the Climate Science 250 report where they talk about Indigenous climate leadership. What does that look like? They have it there, but not really quite sure, because what these, with this work, this research or this policy work or work in communities, the advocacy work happening there should lead to First Nations or Indigenous people's own self-determined solutions about how to meet the challenges that they're facing. Again, because we have a long tradition that can inform that process and that others can learn from. Now, it doesn't mean it excludes other people, because you can scale it up. Like I said, we're asked all the time to contribute to other people's assessments, other people's plans, other people's climate strategies. So then you have your own basis to do that, as opposed to I'm the only one who's in a meeting with 100 other people trying to contribute something. And maybe I get like a word or a bullet, like in a whole report or something like that, right? So there needs to be a lot of the support for Indigenous communities to do this. One of the maybe the second to last climate assessments that we were doing for Ipcc was we had like 2 pages to try to talk about Canada, US, Mexico, Indigenous peoples, like you know, climate change impacts, and we were trying to get the narrative to what about Indigenous peoples and governance? Because most of it is, that's not considered at all. It's like, these impacts are happening to Indigenous people. How do we fix that? How do we govern that? As opposed to maybe Indigenous peoples, if you recognize them as my opening slide as societies and governments, maybe we want to govern this in our own communities. And it was really hard to find literature on that. Like, that is not a topic that people are super interested in. It's mostly, again, how you're going to contribute to others, which is fine, but not a lot for supporting Indigenous self-determined solutions. So that part was really hard to do, and we did that like the summer of 2021. So I'm still always on a search to see what's coming up in terms of, you know, where you see Indigenous people, governance and climate change in the title, because that's what you have to do. There has to be certain things in the title. It has to be in the peer-reviewed literature. There's all this criteria about what's going to count as knowledge in a lot of these assessments. So what was important to young people? Again, the earth, language, and identity being tied into the supporting of Indigenous language and identity. So a lot of the things that you wouldn't normally think of as being part of climate change or planetary health solutions, like language, is really important. So really that's like all the time in Indigenous climate meetings, but not really talked about in other kind of climate change meetings that I find myself in. People don't, like, what does language have to do with this? But it's really central and important in the Turtle Lodge climate declaration. They had some meetings with scientists. That's one of their major recommendations. Natural law and language in terms of how to move forward. Listening to the land, or learning from the land. I just included this one. Well, looking at the time, I guess I'm starting to run out. So what I've done right now with a research project is we're actually trying to figure out what do some of these self-determined solutions look like. And so what I, again, find in these circles I find myself in, because there's, again, we're always in other people's circles most of the time, is how do you do climate assessment when you don't know what the baseline is? Like, the research hasn't been done. And I've always said, but we do have that. Like we do have climate knowledge. And so I'm working on the project as part of natural law is also what the 13 moon system is. So we have stories around each moon. Each moon has it's one moon going through 13 phases, has a name and sometimes multiple names and stories associated with it about what you do during these moons. And I say, but we already do through the 13 moon system. It's already telling us what should be happening. And if that's not happening, then that's a problem. And so the research is based on what happens during the 13 moons. And there's a lot of stories that go with each moon. Some of them might focus on animals, some of them on plants, some of them on people, some of them on different elements of the natural world. So we do have this climate knowledge. We do have this baseline knowledge. So during each of the 13 moons, I'm documenting to see what some of the changes are. Now, what's interesting, I don't know why, but I was thinking about this recently, but in the turtle, so there's the woman's relationship to the moon. So again, the moon is considered in our world. It's not like this thing way over there outside of our concept of environment or the natural world. It's very much part of it. We're governed by the moon. It's part of natural law. But also the turtle has is connected to the 13 moons. there's a name for them, and someone did tell me, but I don't remember what they are. But on the shell, that's like 13 of the little 13 of these, and then 28 of these around the turtle that connects to the moon, like the 28 days and the 13 moons. And so then it's Turtle Island, and a lot of the Anishinaabe recreation stories around the work and the contribution of the turtle. And I always tell people I did terrorize the poor turtle, and I did count, because I can't help myself. As I was trying to help it across the road so it wouldn't get run over, I said, just a minute, like, you moved, I got to start counting again. So it's so this is sort of, so I'm trying to do this research that's based on Anishinaabe knowledge, Anishinaabe laws, and these connections to the natural world, like trying to figure out how can I make this, well, it wasn't abstract for thousands of years, but now it kind of is a reality in the work that we do, or the work that I'm doing. So these are just different conceptions of models of well-being. And the reason I included them is in Indigenous conceptions of well-being, they automatically included the natural world. So there already were concepts of planetary well-being and health, and how we understand health, period. Also, like maybe some of you are familiar also with One Health. I could say the same thing about One Health, is that we got that, except we didn't divide up our world in the same way as the One Health perspective does. That's another meeting in November. So our relatives. So how do we learn from the natural world? Our nature-based solutions. So what is the story the Earth is telling us about climate change? What stories does the Earth have? Because the Earth has a lot of knowledge. Paying attention and respect to our ancestors. This is where we would generate a lot of our knowledge. And I'll just suggest, if you're really interested in, so this youth elders gathering that I facilitated, it was over 4 days, but there's like a 5-minute video that you can find on the Chiefs of Ontario website, or I can send it to Dr. King and she can share it with you. And my son's in it very briefly, but there's this brilliant young woman, Jade Willoughby. Pay attention to her words, and what she talked about, what she said climate change was, and this just sticks with me like forever, was she just said climate change is Mother Earth communicating with us about what's happening to her. That's what it is. So what people call disasters is actually the Earth saying, whatever it is you're doing, it's not a good thing, and I'm trying to tell you, and I'm trying to communicate with you that this is what's going on. So there's still very much this connection to the Earth and what the Earth is trying to communicate to us. She was from Northern Ontario, and she hadn't, she's not studying planetary health. This is sort of what she hears in her community and how she understands what's happening in the world. So these stories that we have and these relationships that they have tell us a lot. Piping the Eagle. So to me, there's similarities when I think about the Ipcc reports, the international panel on climate, intergovernmental panel on climate change, all those scientific experts from around the world, sort of the narrative that they draw, these pages, reports that are hundreds of pages long, is that humans are the cause of climate change. Actually, that was more in the recent report. Without a doubt, humans are the cause. I'm like, I thought we kind of already knew that, but I guess you can't say it because it's going to have policy implications, right? But also in the Piping the Eagle story, because humans are not behaving properly in relation to the natural world. And it's the natural world that has to bail us out of the situation because we don't get it. We're not getting it. So sometimes we need to turn to nature for guidance to help us get out of this situation that we're in. So this is a picture of my niece in the sugar bush. So these are the questions that we would ask ourselves. So what is this future that we want, where we want to love the Earth? So again, this comes up in Indigenous climate circles, the youth gathering. It came up as really important. You ask yourself, am I behaving in a way that's showing love for the Earth and future generations? How will our work benefit future generations? What kind of ancestor am I going to be? So these are the kind of questions that you ask yourself in planetary health discussions or well-being discussions or climate discussions, other than all the different ways you have to reduce carbon, which is important, but it needs to be way broader than that. And I'll just interject here because I can't help myself, is so part of when, must have been for another grant that I was that I was writing. I think probably for the shirk that's supporting the 13 Moon Project, let me just call it the 13 Moon Project, is coming across a report. And what the report was someone actually studied it over the last 50 years about where climate change research was being funded. Very little in terms of the human dimension, for lack of a better word. Most of it was in the science and technology aspect, which is fine, but it was like 800 and almost like 800% more there. So to me, there's probably enough knowledge there to address that situation, but we're not so good on the human dimension. There's been a real absence and gap. The other thing that they found in this particular report was, actually it wasn't in the report, it was in a follow-up report where most of the people that were contributing to this 800% more or to the climate knowledge were people from the global north, and generally, and weirdly, I actually thought it was really weird that it was generally men from Europe. I thought North America would dominate that, but it was actually Europe, Northern Europe. So there's a huge bias in the knowledge that exists out there that's influencing governance and policy. That's ignoring the global south. There were no Indigenous people. Like, they did this other study on the top 100, who are the top 100 climate scientists. Very few women. And I think maybe someone counted maybe 5 people of color, and that was it. So there's a huge bias. So how do we start, again, filling this gap in terms of our knowledge? What kind of questions are we going to ask ourselves? As I'm a researcher, I don't need to know the answer. My job is to ask the questions and go out and talk to people out there who know a lot more than I do, and then I try to mobilize it for, I guess, other people to consume, or hopefully, ideally, make good decisions. I like to end with this. I'm not a great storyteller, but one of my favorite storytellers is Isaac Day. And he uses this metaphor that we're all in this sacred story. We're all part of the story of the earth unfolding, the story of the earth, and what's happening to the earth and how we're going to relate to the earth, but we're all in it, whether you're a scientist or engineer or a young person or a baby, and we're all going to decide who we're going to be in that story. It's always a decision about who we're going to be, but we're all in the story together. So it's not only an Indigenous story or a scientist story, but that we're all part of the story. So, miigwech, I am done. Hopefully that made sense. I was able to draw connections. It sounded good in the grant that I wrote. And so hopefully, hopefully it made sense. Hopefully it made sense to you, and it's just in time because I'm starting to lose my voice. So Chimigwech for being here, and for those listening online, Chimigwech. Is it question and answer? Is there any comments? It could be comments too, or observations. Go ahead. I'm going to turn Rick over to answer that one.
Some territories they migrated, others they.
Yeah, we just, like Anishinaabeg and Haudenosaunee, even though we're kind of around the Great Lakes, we have very different language and cultures. And so a lot of it is, yeah, the land that we come from, the language represents the land that we come from. So we're, yeah, I'm Anishinaabeg are not like Inuit. I would not be remotely helpful on ice or hunting seals or anything like that. It would just be very bad to rely on. Yeah, I'm much better at catching fish in the Great Lakes. So, and knowing some of the medicines and what berries to pick. So, yeah, a lot of our knowledge comes from, like, literally the land itself. Oh.
Thank you so much for your presentation, for sharing the principles for reconciliation. I'd probably ask you sort of the impossible political question of the evening, but in your view or your opinion, what types of politics would be needed to make these principles real and binding society as a whole? Like, what politics would be most effective shifting from the ideal of earth-based reconciliation practices that already happen in planetary health, making them sort of like vast, massive, binding at local, national, and global level? governance. And so the second part of that question would be that, like, what are the biggest impediments or barriers to bringing these ideas to fruition at a scale that is sort of, you know, massive, I guess. So I sort of, this is sort of political mechanisms in place, right? That be most effective or most efficient, you know, to bring these wonderful ideas for the greatest number of people in the shortest amount of time.
On to the second one first, because I think, like, for me, and this I sort of learned because I moderated a session, like a short big idea session with Sheila Watt-Kluche, and a lot of it is just lack of imagination. We just can't imagine what it's like to not have what we just consume all the time. So a lot of it is, that's why I think young people are like so needed as part of this, because they're not so bogged down with our everyday. So a lot of it is just lack of imagination. What it would be like to not, I don't know, depend and consume in the way that we are, right? And so and I agree with her, like we just kind of lack that amount. What is it like? What does a transformed world look like? But like when I think about like the way my grandparents lived, like that I saw, I actually, like my life transformed. So I kind of have some sense of what that is, but a lot of it is, like, quite frankly, just a lack of imagination. People can't imagine what that would, what that looks like. For the first question, I'm trying to remember what our recommendations were on the policy brief. Like one of the calls essentially, well, this is before that, this is being recorded. Anyway, we have recommendations in there that we think that have a lot to do with, you know, not subsidizing like fossil fuel industry, like those kind of decisions that are being made, like how much, and just to me, for me, just a lack of contradiction. Like, how do you like support, like say in Ontario, Ring of Fire? Like why? Like that doesn't make any sense at all in terms of planetary well-being or climate change. And so I think stop making like really bad decisions. So that's not even like asking anybody to do anything different. It's just stop doing really dumb things, right? Like that's just, and like, so a lot of the fossil fuel sort of subsidies. So that's possible actually. And the other part is, I don't think, like when I think about the last sort of environmental reform for, you know, environmental assessment, just how there was so much innovation that could have happened if it wasn't for the industry lobby that happened, like how kind of governments caved to it, and it's nowhere near what it could have been in terms of like, you know, environmental protection, conservation, and reconciliation, whatever. And so you're pumping a lot of money into, you know, conserved areas. You know, there was a recent announcement on that, but at the same time, be, you know, supporting and being okay about other kind of development. So there's a lot of contradiction in there, like in terms of, and you could make a different decision, like, but those kind of different decisions aren't being made. The other thing that we were advocating for was, maybe some of you are familiar with Ingrid Waldron's work around the bill that she's putting forward, because a lot of this has to do with like racism and inequity and colonization, where, I mean, the act that she's putting through, like we're supporting that, but that's more for like existing kind of legislation. Think about these kind of things, as opposed to there actually needs to be a bit more of an overhaul, but it's at least a start, because it's putting it in the radar, because that's not really in the radar in terms of addressing those particular aspects of underbelly of society that actually plays out in terms of this. So I think very much different decisions could be made, like not let's say yes to this and then throw all kinds of money at these other solutions that are going to be impossible to have an impact when you've got this other stuff going on. So I think in some of the, again, that lack of imagination. So in some of the, so the tables that they set up to do the national adaptation strategy, that's part of the federal government's climate change approaches. I found that because I'm more on the health, I was more involved in the health side of it. It's very hard for people to pop out of the silos. Very hard. Like public health people stick to the public health stuff, and then, you know, different other whatever people's profession is and how they're trained kind of stick to that. Like people don't want to pop out and think about what is the everyday lived kind of experience in this? And we don't experience it in these like very siloed kind of streamed kind of ways. So even with the most forward thinking people who know there needs to be dramatic change, it's really hard to pop out of those. I was really trying to push for, let's just go for the throat here in terms of our recommendations, but they didn't really want to go there. Right. So yeah, so to me, it's trying to imagine what the world would be like. Like there's a lack of imagination because people don't have a frame of reference for what it could be. And like I think about electric cars, like yay in some ways, but that doesn't work in Pewanik. And I remember saying to, I was sitting around the table as, part of this other circle that I was in, and I said, I think the point is we're not supposed to want that. Like, I think we actually have to do overhaul of values, right? And that didn't go well. We're all supposed to want a Tesla. And so I think, so to me, that's the harder part for people. It's easier to think of the techno things because we can still live this life of consumption and not, I'll try to answer that question. I know it's because it's a great question. And it's like literally, I'm part of these places where we're trying to push for courage and bravery and all those kind of things is, it's, again, what I learned for people who think in the language. And it was kind of cool today because I met, so one of the people where those aha moments came was the late elder Robin Green. And so I met his son today. I sort of recognized, he goes, Robin Green, your dad. And so he's from Treaty 3. But this was way back in the day when I was in graduate school, when sustainable development was all the rage, Brundtland Report and whatever else. And the government in Canada signed on to whatever, and the Earth Summit in '92. And so they were going to different, First Nations, Indigenous people across the country saying, what is sustainable development? And, the concept of sustainable development is how do we keep this consumer, how do we keep doing what we're doing into future generations, right? In a sustainable way. Basically, how do we kind of keep taking and doing what we're doing? And Robin, who thought in the language, was a fluent language speaker, said, that's not how Anishinaabe think. We get up every day and think about what our gift is going to be to the earth, not what we're going to take from it in a sustainable way. So that's what I mean by that lack of imagination. He came from a world where it was different. And he could see this in a way that that I didn't, but that was one of those big aha moments, and I went, that's a totally different way of understanding that relationship. So maybe we need to get up every day and think about, what is our gift going to be? Like, what are we going to actually do that's going to allow the earth to flourish, as opposed to minimize the damage, mitigate the damage, just, damage control. Like, that's a particular attitude and mindset. So I appreciate your question. It's one I think about, but I think it has a lot to do with values and lack of imagination. We don't know what it'd be like, and it's kind of scary for people, right? So it's a good question. I wish I was more eloquent, but I'm in places where we think about these kind of things, and it's all like, that's never going to work. So you're already constrained as opposed to being imaginative, right? Yeah. So thank you for the question. I think there was another one somewhere. Yeah. Oh, okay.
I'm going to ask about a slightly different term. And I'm going to ask about what your opinion. By the way, I absolutely love your talk, your holistic view of it, and your well-being is very, very well done. But the sustainable planetary well-being kind of way, what does living well mean? And reference it several times. And I think you've given us the answer in response. But so I think it's living with less material goods, right? Some sense. And the change of mindset that's required people to generally be happy and without all that material. That's sort of part of what we would envisage as a final or as an optimal state.
There's definitely inequity, and a lot of people have more than others. I don't know if I would tell people who don't have much to have less, but so I think there needs to be, but yeah, to some extent, like when I think about, maybe some of you are familiar with, I always recommend people read Raman Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass piece. And so she talks about, so the concept for us is Mininamadzuin, how do you live well? And live well isn't just for people, it's like, it's not possible for me to live well if Anishinaabeg world is not well, right? And so she talks about it as renewing this covenant that we have with the natural world, understanding what these laws are and respecting them. So that means actually having a relationship. I think about some of the elders and knowledge holders that I've worked with, and I'm like, I know like basically almost nothing compared to them. So someone like the late Josephine Mondawmin, who worked around the Great Lakes, she would say, go listen to the water. And I'd be like, okay. So I could go down and I could hear things, but I couldn't listen in the way that she could. Like she could do her songs and ceremonies and heal that water. I don't know how to do that. But there's people who do. So I think it's also trying to develop that deeper kind of relationship. When I do presentations, and I'm not great at it for little kids because I'm used to teaching university, and I'm always asked that question, what can we do? How can we start sort of reestablishing this relationship to the earth? And I would just say, you have to kind of go outside, and you kind of have to start trying to, because at natural law, and again, that was the talk this morning and not this one, is the idea is that the answers are already there in the natural world. It's just your ability to understand what's going on, the ability to be able to read it or have that knowledge revealed to you. That people that Rick would know. I know people who can do that. I'm not so great at it because I spend most of my time being an academic in front of a screen. And so it's like, how do you get people to reconnect and use their senses to be able to do that? Kids can do it. Like they're seeing the world in high definition. I'm seeing it fuzzy, black and white, 1950s TV because of the kind of world I'm finding myself in, right? So that they can see and they can sense things that we can't because we trained ourselves out of it. So to me, I say you need to be able to do that again. We need to be able to read and understand and have this revealed to us again. And so I think that's one of the places to start, because I think when you have that, I guess it would be love and this personal relationship to the natural world, then you're less reluctant to destroy it. Like you're just like, I don't want to do that. That's not a good thing to be doing. Or Rick sharing the story about how, when you are going to take a life, because we did, there was protocol around that. It wasn't, you just didn't willy-nilly go out and do those kind of things. There was going to be consequences. Hillary always says this in his stories. A bad decision is going to have consequences. And in the life that we had for thousands of years, you felt that right away. But we can do things and not feel the consequence right away in the kind of life that we're living right now, right? But we are, like it is happening, maybe to some people inequitably more than others, but there is. So that's what I tell them, because to me, there's hope for them because they can still do it. Because we haven't educated it out of them yet. So we haven't taught them to focus only on reading, only on understanding the world in a certain way, that they can still see possibilities that we've sort of kind of, I'm an educator and I'll admit it, we've kind of educated a lot of people. I know I require people to read a lot. I'm trying to move away from that and get students in law especially to start listening, do more podcasts. Like don't even take notes, just listen and just tell me what you learned. Like there's no right answer to what I'm looking for here. And they get really upset about that because you have to have a right answer. I'm like, there isn't going to be one for what I'm asking you to do. So we have to teach differently, I think. So I know it's a kind of a roundabout kind of way of answering that, but when I'm asked that by young people, that's what I suggest that they do. Because you can do it. It's harder for me, but you can do it. And understand what that consequence is right away, which my ancestors and even up to my great-grandparents would have felt right away. If, a great decision wasn't made, you saw the immediate results of that and experienced that. So I don't know if that's helpful. It's just so multifaceted and so many things have to happen at so many different realms that I don't think we should just be leaving it in the hands of the kind of people that have had their hands on it for the last, 5 decades. It needs to be a lot broader conversation than it has been. Sorry, that's long-winded and I'm keeping you late. So. You just said like, I'm always trying to get them to learn, like respect different kinds of knowing. That's my giving. I just had to ask.
What do you think is worth listening to? Or you said that, I gotta know, what's worth listening to that we can, like, that I can have access to. Because I'm trying to.
I think I tend to assign, and again, I think it would still resonate with at the high school level is probably almost anything by Robin Kimmerer. She's pretty accessible. Talks by elders and other knowledge holders because they already, what I say, talk like a human, as opposed to academics, which it can be so abstract and caught up in terminologies like, I don't even know what you're saying. That doesn't, like, you don't want people to spend all their time trying to figure out what someone's saying. You want the story to be, told. I think youth are putting out a lot more pieces that I think, one thing I found that is one of the reasons why I used to drag my son around with me a lot is, like, a lot of young people really don't need another middle-aged lady telling them what to do, right? So sometimes they like to hear from other youth, and their thinking and what they're doing, because that's where you see a lot of that imagination and creativity, because they're not bound by me saying that's never going to go with the federal government that we're going to get. Like, they're not going to get elected if they do that. They're not bound by that, right? They're just like, we need to do this. This is something we could do, right? They're not so caught up in disciplines and who's going to get elected because of this. So those are ones that I would recommend that I assign. It depends. Like some of Albert Marshall's work around two-eyed seeing, because that's the reality, is that we need like, the other thing I would say about Indigenous societies, if you recognize the societies and governments, is we want to make the best decisions too, and that includes science. We're not rejecting science. We want the best knowledge to make the best decisions. And what does that look like? So he has very specific Mi'kmaq ideas about what that is. I'd be reluctant to apply it everywhere. There's a bit of a, well, that doesn't really work in Blackfoot country. They're more ethical space, where Great Lakes, it's more like Tuor Wampum kind of approach. So I tried to do accessible, where they might think I'm giving them an environment, let's say podcast or a piece by Robin Kimmerer, but it's also addressing governance. They tend to be more holistic, so you can almost use it for, like, I'll assign the same thing to environmental studies to law, and that I used to assign in geography, because they're going to be able to connect to it. Yeah, and listening, you use a different part of the brain. I tell them, they're just like rolling their eyes. I'm like, use a different part of your brain, listen, yeah. And so, and they like it, because there's too much reading, and reading trains your brain a particular way, because you're going from left to right and down the page. Encouraging people to do art, like that piece I showed you, the youth did it in art. We didn't tell them to do that. I didn't instruct them to do that. They're just coming up with stuff, right? So when you're not confining people, then they're a lot more creative. And it's hard, because my job as an educator is I have to evaluate in certain ways. So you're always, there's a lot of being creative about how you want people to learn and be in the world. But at the same time, meet your professional obligations. Yeah. So I'm pretty sure everybody here is in that situation. Yeah.
Just made it right, which is funny because they are both horrible. It's right. But I guess the question that I have is that both of them in the current structure of capital, it seems as if it is somewhat incompatible. One of the few things, among other historical that there wasn't this fire and then inevitably I guess given the structure of how our society is and how we're trying to tackle would there be, or would you feel that there is some overlap between what we talked about tonight and the term structure of the day, and where would you find the most productivity in that? This is, I know some people talk about stakeholder capitalism, kind of a bridge between two things, but I guess in your opinion, how would you kind of say like how how they did it. Amazing.
I think the way that I would answer that is, I wouldn't really call, like, because I guess I grapple with this in terms of theory. I'm not a big theory head. I think because I work so much directly with communities, and they don't care. Like, they'll just, if I try to talk like that, they're like, "Did you drink the Kool-Aid?" And I'm like, "No, sorry, I'll talk like a human again." And so so the way of life that I talked about wasn't set out to be anti-capitalist, so it gets taken up by a lot of people in that way. It's like, we weren't like sitting, my ancestors weren't sitting around 5,000 years ago. I think we're going to be anti-capitalist. We didn't really care about Marx. It was just, that was the way that people lived and made sense and was sustainable and enabled people to live well. And I think it's actually still there. And it isn't like people on the land, and it's becoming more, I guess I don't want to say more common, it already was. It was already there, like I remember it when I was growing up. I guess what it is now is it's more within the public realm than you saw 20 years ago. Like, people call it land-based work, land-based, but it was always there. So to me, that was always there. And it's not like people are sitting there in ceremony going, "We're being anti-capitalist, we're such Marxists." Like, that's not what's happening in those situations. People are just living their obligations and responsibilities. So to me, that's already there. And it's more, and you're right, like the kind of world that we're living in is not very earth friendly or or Indigenous friendly in very many ways. But the world wasn't always that either. And so again, it's thinking in terms of possibilities and imagination. So the best way I can think of to answer the question is, it's already there. A few years ago, maybe it was during the pandemic, actually, probably the June after it, was the Indigenous Economics Conference, because that's what we talked about. What does it look like? What does it look like to have a different kind of economics? Economics itself isn't a bad word. Everybody had economics for how you were going to live, but what does that look like in terms of not necessarily anti-capitalist? Because as soon as you do that, that becomes your frame of reference for everything. And I don't want that to be the frame of reference for how I think. Like, it's more, I just happen to be in these spaces where it's the elephant in the room and no one wants to say it, right? Except me, which makes me really popular. And sometimes I don't get invited back I guess I'm not going back to this meeting. So, and so it's a hard question to answer, but I think it's one I know we're grappling with in communities, right? Because in some communities where basic human rights aren't being met, it becomes really tempting in impact benefit agreements to agree to certain things. And, communities get criticized for that. I'm like, when basic human rights aren't being met, it looks pretty good to get them met in this different way, right? And also the fiduciary responsibility by the Crown isn't being met either. So, but in my mind, it's already there. And a lot of it's going to go unrecognized because the people who are generally, I guess, living in this way or have that philosophy towards the world aren't running around saying, "Hey, look at me." I'm like, okay, there's some, but most people aren't drawing attention to themselves in that way because they're just doing it. And so to me, that in my lifetime, it's starting to grow from what I've seen. My mother's a residential school survivor, so she didn't teach me the language, but my son knows a lot more than I do. He could read the Chinaka to you or recite it to you in the language I cannot. So my younger son's way better at fishing than I am, and I grew up fishing. So I think it's there, and I think it's true in other societies as well. And I think maybe in some ways you want to fly under the radar because then you become a target, right? I mean, that's part of the resistance and the direct action kind of stuff is when you're not under the radar anymore. So I don't know. I just think it's work that we have to do. And again, imagine a world that's not like that. Yeah, I know it's not a satisfactory answer, but at this climate change conference, someone was asked the question. It was Ariel, the executive director for Indigenous Climate Action, look at their work. Basically was saying, how do we stop capitalism? No one on the panel could answer the question. The guy goes, I don't know how to stop it. But he was a former leader and he goes, sometimes we have to say no to stuff and it's going to go through. Like they say no to a pipeline, and it's going to go through anyway, and then they're stuck with the consequences of that, right? Even though it wasn't their decision to make that, but their desire was to continue to live sustainably with the earth and according to their traditions and laws and language. That was and the intention is still there despite this challenge. So if I had the answer to that, I'd probably win the Nobel Prize, or maybe not. I'd be an enemy of the state. It's hard to know, like which category I would fit in. Yeah, so that's kind of how I think about that. I think people already are, but they're not always drawing attention to themselves. And it's not based on what Canada's doing or any of these ideologies. It's like what they do, and they've always done. That's kind of how I think about that. However unarticulated or unsatisfying that answer is. But it's a good question. It's going to keep me up. I'll say 4 o'clock in the morning, oh, I thought of this, I should have answered that, but that's how it works sometimes.
Maybe for very short question.
Or comment, like I'm happy to hear other people's insights and knowledge as well. Okay.
I was drawn years ago to the idea of the law of emergency, and that we can't conceive of an emergency that's 150 years away. That's a lot of the rhetoric around climate change. Is there a language that we could use that is more transformative rather than this fear-based emergency language that you think might be helpful?
I think the planetary well-being one could be a counter to that. And again, I keep calling them circle because this is public and going to be on the thing, so I don't want to exactly out the people or the circle that I was in. But again, it was in one where we were discussing things. It was right around the time of the flooding in BC, and the way the conversation was unfolding was nature is such an enemy of people. Like it was such like terrible nature, terrible. And I just remember like being really sick to my stomach, thinking that's not the problem. So because and again, in that very sort of very negative space to be, which I can see when you're in the midst of it, right? Like people are in the midst of this, and that's how they're experiencing it. Because in that case, it is like they call them climate disasters at that point. Beyond emergency, it's now a disaster situation. And but they didn't. It was very hard. There was a few of us who tried to say, well, like the reason why that's happening is because of this disruption, disconnection that's already happened, right? And this is like an outcome because of that. But it's hard to see that in the moment. So I think that's one of the reasons why I'm trying to focus on something that's more hopeful, like self-determined solutions. Like why do young people have to keep inheriting like deeper and deeper problems? Like maybe we have to start thinking about why don't they inherit solutions, right? Like what are we doing to enable that? What does planetary well-being look like? So that gives you something visionary to strive for, as opposed to always damage control or mitigation. So I think that's one of the reasons why I'm interested to that very question that you have, because I've seen it and it's really distressing to me. Like I find it in those moments really upsetting. I'm just like, that attitude is just going to make things worse. I'm thinking as opposed to what is it that we want to see? What is it that we want to actually put energy into? Not to diminish a disaster, a lot of energy has to go into dealing with that, right? That's real people's lives, but also what is our vision going to be? I might have a bias because Anishinaabe are very visionary. We have ceremonies for vision. Like we're supposed to think in terms of vision and supposed to think in terms of hope, right? So, because we faced our destruction before in our stories, and we have instruction for how to get out of it, or how to reestablish the balance again. I guess not get out of it, but it's actually not getting out of it. It's actually realizing what our obligations and responsibilities are. Being reminded about what they are is actually kind of what our solutions are, for lack of a better word. So it's a good question, and I think that's why I'm trying to move in that direction, because it's really distressing when in some of these spaces I'm in, I'm like, oh no, like how do you even fix that or try to address that? But So I don't know if that's satisfactory, but I think trying to think in more hopeful ways and visionary ways when, and imaginative ways and creative ways when everything that is coming at us is not that. Like it's actually an effort to have to do it. So thank you for the question.
Okay, so I want to thank you for a great talk. Look into it thoroughly, and I think there's so much that resonates. I mean, anyone's been working on this issue for as long as we have. There's so much that you said that I'm probably guilty of working with all those organizations you talked about. I've seen the tokenism, I've seen the exclusion, you know, of the voice, right? And it's just so great to see that someone like yourself is there participating and demanding more of us. So it's just wonderful. Nature-based solutions, all the money, yes. So Germany is now offering $500 million in grant money, by the way, to work on nature-based solutions to the biodiversity crisis.
Okay.
Say my wife and I are working on a proposal now with some people.
I probably will too, but reframe it differently. Yeah.
Exactly. I like that, as you said, part of that conception of nature where it's not working. But we can go on. I know we'll have future discussion. Thank you so much. I just wanted to thank our sponsors for this event as well. First of all, Carla Cicerone, who professor in social science and humanities, and helped put together this sort of idea to bring Dr. McGregor here. Carpenters Union Local 397, the Ontario Tech Indigenous Reconciliation Task Force, and Ontario Tech Indigenous Education and Cultural Services. But most of all, of course, thank you again for your talk this evening, and big wish.
Thanks for having me. Thank you for coming on a Tuesday night and staying. You know, at least you won't have traffic. So hopefully, thank you for your opening as well.